Welcome to Theory and Operation for Removing the Transmission, Part 2. In this course, you'll learn the basics in safety and efficiently removing the transmission as well as the overall review of the process. My name is Lance Wiggins, and I'll be your host. It's a great day to fix transmissions, so let's get started. Transmissions come in many different styles and configurations. The specific R&R procedure you will follow may and probably will vary, depending on the manufacturer, the transmission, and how the vehicle is equipped. Many of the procedures explained here are generic in nature and will be pretty much the same no matter what type of car or truck you're working on. In other cases, there will be specific differences for each vehicle. Always consult a shop manual or a service program for specific procedures that apply to the vehicle you're working on. Here's a classic list of a front-wheel drive R&R procedure. On front-wheel drive vehicles, follow the processes listed in those guidelines. The most important part of the process is making sure that you have the engine secured using the proper support fixture. Do not try to cheat through this process. Serious injury may occur. There are different scenarios, such as marking the position of the converter for the flex plate, rotating the crankshaft for removal of the bolts, positioning the transmission jack before removing the crossmember or any other bell housing bolts, as well as making sure that you have transmission jacks underneath the front-wheel drive transmission and your support is connected to both sides of the wheel well areas and the top framing portion of the vehicle. Some cars take up to 6 to 8 hours to remove. Others are a little easier. Again, the key to removing the front-wheel drive transmission is making sure you have the proper engine support fixture. On rear-wheel drive vehicles, you're going to raise the vehicle, drain the transmission fluid, mark the drive shaft to the rear axle before disconnecting to avoid any run-out related variations. Pretty common. Disconnect all the electrical harnesses, remove the torque converter bell housing bolts, disconnect the transmission cooler lines, the drive shaft, any selector levers, cross members, etc., starter motors, remove the transmission, and start with your rebuild process. One of the biggest keys on any transmission R&R is to make sure that you have the proper jack and that you have the transmission secured to that jack with either a chain or a strap. As far as any case issues, occasionally you'll come through and you'll see either broken ears on the case, maybe cracks in the case. There may be some issues where the case looks like it's sweating or you have some sort of leak. You'll want to replace the case in any of these conditions, either broken ears or worm tracks, any cracked areas, any worn dowel pin or alignment hole areas. Avoid trying to repair these cases because there's really no way to be sure that the repair will actually hold, and because the case is very thin and welding it may distort it. If any of the bolts removed during disassembly have aluminum on them, in other words that you've pulled the threads out, you may be able to repair those using a tap and boring and installing a sort of a thread insert, which serves as new threads for bolts. After the threads have been repaired, make sure you can clean out the case thoroughly. Dealing with exhaust regulations throughout the country, there are different types of regulations in the EPA and how they deal with those regulations. In most cases, in most states, catalytic converters are not to be messed with. However, in other states, really isn't that big of a deal. So this is going to be kind of a generic statement about exhaust systems. Anytime you work on a vehicle, no matter what you're doing, make sure that when you get it, it gets returned in its same shape or better. Okay, so on many vehicles, it's necessary to remove parts of the exhaust system to get the transmission out of the vehicle. This is important because the laws are, obviously vary with the vehicles in state to state. The exhaust system is part of the emissions control, which is your electronic control for your engine. And quite simply put, if you're the last one to touch it, more than likely you're going to be responsible. So before you remove the first bolt of the exhaust, it's important that you examine it, make sure that everything's there and it's in good shape. You're definitely going to have rusted bolts. You'll definitely have stripped bolts. These things are where you get the hot wrench out and you start taking those things out and trying to repair those as best you can. Just make sure that whatever comes out of the vehicle to remove the transmission simply just goes back in. There are different types of axles that we're going to be talking about here. The first one we're going to talk about is our CV joint. Now, this is a typical inner CV joint. The majority of the cars on the road, the front wheel drive, have these. The axle must be allowed to flex with the suspension and turn with the steering wheel. A lot of times you'll hear the click, 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 or clack, clack, clack sound. That means that the CV joint boot is probably torn and all of the oil or grease that's inside there has been removed just via the leak. The device is called a constant velocity joint, otherwise known as CV. Each axle uses two CV joints, an inboard that rides near the transaxle and the outboard that mounts to the steering knuckle. Here's a classic example of an outboard to take a look at. There's also output seals, and the seals on the transaxle for the outboard and CVT. There's also a bearing and a bushing that rides inside there for your transmission, usually on the differential area. In some cases, you'll have these seals leak, and when they leak and fluid level drops below that bearing lubrication area, then you start having some bearing issues, and the axle will then start to wobble out. The outboard CV joint slips through the bearing into the steering knuckle and through the splines in the front wheel drive hub. The splines of the front wheel drive hub are something you also want to make sure that are clean. Use a little wire brush, slide it in and out, and that'll clean that up. You can use a little bit of lubrication grease as well to make sure that slides through there. There is a nut on the end of that which needs to be torqued. Each torque is different, so I didn't list the torques here for you because each torque is different. You're going to want to check with your manufacturer or check your shop manual just to verify those. Drive shafts and U-joints. On the left-hand side is a typical front two-wheel drive front yoke assembly. The picture on the right-hand side is a non-typical rear differential and yoke assembly that's been wrapped up by, I believe, a box spring is what that is. But most rear-wheel drive vehicles require drive shaft to transmit torque from the transmission output shaft to the differential. This is a straight shaft with at least two flexing joints called universal joints or U-joints. They allow drive shaft angles to change as the suspension flexes to meet changes in the roadway. Check the yokes for wear or damage and replace them as necessary. You may be able to repair a slight wear along with the seal surface by polishing the yoke. However, if the groove is too far or it's discolored or blued, you really want to look inside there and check the bushing. More than likely the bushing has been damaged. And if the bushing is damaged, chances are you're not going to be able to fix that leak just by replacing the seal and messing around with the yoke. When the transmission is out, there are a few things that you can do to upsell if your shop is capable of doing that, or it is something that they choose to do. Lots of transmission shops simply just deal with transmission issues, but in a lot of cases, there's an opportunity to upsell some work. So when the transmission is out, as the R&R technician, you're going to want to look at a few things. The first thing you want to look at is the freeze plugs. Typically listed behind the block. There's 3 of them that we listed right here for you to have a look at, or 2 of them, I should say. These freeze plugs can leak. They can be seeping a little bit. They can be eroded or corroded. So while the transmission is out of the car or out of the vehicle, you have that opportunity for additional repairs. This is because certain components are only accessible when the transmission is out. Freeze plugs are one of those. If you end up replacing the freeze plug, there's an opportunity to replace it with a cup plug type of freeze plug or an expansion type plug that slips in there. You don't have to over tighten the plug too much, just tighten enough to make the seal firmly against the block. Another thing you can do is replace the rear main seal. In some cases, I should say most cases, the rear main seal is a full circle seal. You pull the flex plate off and you'll be able to see the rear main seal located right there. In other cases, it is a what they call a lip or a rope type seal, which are usually on the older models. So when you're in there and you see any type of leakage before you're pulling the transmission out, there's a great opportunity to start selling some upsell here. Flex plates and flywheels. The most important thing that you're going to want to know here is to make sure that when you remove the transmission, that you have all the bolts out for the torque converter, and that as you're taking the transmission out, that you're not prying on the flex plate, you're not bending the flex plate, not bending the flywheel, or bending or having the flywheel being damaged. Okay, so just going to cover a few things here to try to get your mind at ease here. So when replacing a flywheel or flex plate, it's important to compare the old and new components carefully. Here's a few areas to check: your overall size. Make sure that the size, the width, the height, the length are all the same. Gear offset. Look at the teeth. Look at the actual ring gear assembly itself. Make sure that it has the same tooth pattern as the other one. Balance weights. Identify the balance weights on the flex plate. Make sure that the flex plate balance weights are accurate and in correct locations. Make sure they're welded properly. Also, bolt pattern. Bolt pattern is a key. A lot of times, visually, you look at it, oh yeah, it looks the same. And then when you put it on, you get the transmission up there and nothing fits. So take the time, walk the flex plate over, stick it on the torque converter, make sure that it fits, and then place it back up on the crankshaft. As far as your dowel pins go, dowel pins are a very, very simple, small, easy thing that's commonly overlooked. Never are they considered to be one of the common failures. Really isn't one of those issues that's a common failure. The only time that it becomes a common failure is if your transmission bolts are actually loose and the transmission's kind of wobbling around in there. Nevertheless, you definitely don't want to overlook the dowel pins in the alignment of the engine and transmission. If you have a missing or worn dowel pin, that can cause engine vibration, could also cause case breakage. If you have repeated flywheel cracks or damage to the flywheel, or the front or the rear main seal is consistently leaking, you'll want to verify that those dowel pins are in the correct location and that they're seated properly and the widths and circumferences are correct. Inspect the converter's drive lugs and studs carefully. These hold the converter to the flex plate to make sure the converter rotates in line and evenly with the flex plate. The threads on the stud or lugs should be cleaned and in good condition. They should also be tightly seated to the torque converter. Check the shoulder area around the lugs and studs for cracked welds or other damage. Transaxles that don't have their oil pump drive gear directly to the torque converter use a drive shaft that fits into the support bushing inside the converter hub. Check this bushing for wear, measure the inside diameter of the bushing and the outside diameter of the drive shaft. The difference between the two measurements is the amount of clearance. If the clearance is excessive, replace the bushing. Always check the specific factory bolt specs. Make sure that your torques are correct. 9 times out of 10 are in our group. Get their impact gun, zip the bolts in. That's the end of the story. 9 times out of 10, that works properly. It's the one time that you don't want to get caught. So as a precaution, I wanted to just mention this, that it's always important to check your factory specs, tighten it to factory specs, make sure you follow the specs precisely. Over tightening bolts can definitely cause distortion and damage to the mounting areas. Finally, once the transmission's been installed after the overhaul and all of the adjustments and the fluid levels are checked, you're ready for your road test. Once you get back from the road test, put the car back on the lift and check the transmission for any signs of leak. Some leaks won't show up until after the car has been driven for a few miles. While you have it in the air, check the pan bolts, cooler lines, and so on for proper torque. They must have loosened, they could have loosened during your test drive. So just make sure that the torques are up to spec. Recheck your fluid levels. Make sure the vehicle's clean. Make sure your handprints are off of it. Make sure that there's no grease marks inside the vehicle, on the steering wheel, on the shifter. Make sure that you have reset the radio frequencies back to their positions where you had them in the beginning. Make sure that the car is clean of any of your fingerprints and grease, and then you're ready to return this back to the vehicle. This will conclude our course on removing the transmission. We want to thank you for participating in our virtual training solutions powered by APRA. Until next time, let's keep fixing transmissions together.